Hello again. In this video, we are going to talk about a very important concept in programming. And what we're going to talk about are functions. Now, we've actually already used functions, but I didn't tell you about them, so you're going to recognize some of the code that you see today. Now, functions apply to all programming languages, and the rules are basically the same. So they work the same in JavaScript as they do in Python or C# or whichever language you're using. But there are differences in the syntax between the languages. But all the fundamental rules about functions are the same regardless of which language you're using. Alrighty, let's go ahead and create a file inside of our JavaScript folder. So go ahead and right-click on the JavaScript folder, choose New File, and then the name that we're going to call it is functions.html. Functions.html. And go ahead and put in the starter code like that. And then I suppose we should update the title. We'll make it just say functions. And now in the last video, we talked about how you can, different ways to embed JavaScript code in a page. We're just gonna put all the JavaScript code directly in the pages when we're working on our sample files, because that's real convenient. But as you know from the last video, for a real website, you usually put JavaScript code in a separate file. So what I'm going to do here is right underneath the title, I'm going to add a script element like that, and then we can get started talking about functions here. So I'm just going to give myself some space, and then we're ready to go. So as programmers, we often find that we need to repeat the same task over and over again in our code. So for example, this is kind of a silly example, but I had to come up with something. Let's get started by typing this code in right here. Let's just do a few console logs. So console.log, and then I'm just going to put a few dashes in there like that. And then I'm actually going to use the Alt-Shift-Down arrow shortcut to duplicate that a few times. And then in the middle one, I'm going to change it so that it says hello world. Okay, now this is really this isn't a practical example of code. I'm just showing you that we've got a group of statements here that all go together. So what this is going to do when this code runs is, if you look in the console, you'll see the dashed lines and then hello world in between them. Okay, some people make what's called console log art, and they make like cool pictures and stuff by doing all these console logs like that. So here's our crude example of console log art. Okay, anyways, that's not important. The idea is that these three statements are all supposed to be run together at the same time. Okay, so I think you know what would happen if we ran this code right now. We would just see the three console log lines here. Okay, now if I wanted to run these three lines of code again later in my program, I could copy and paste them like this and then paste them, further down in my page, but that would be duplicating this code. A better way to do this is, if you're going to repeat code over and over again, then you should turn it into a function. And let me show you how we're going to do that. So I want you to put your cursor right down here, and then we'll just write a function real quick, and you won't really understand it, but then we'll talk about all the details in a second here. Okay, so go ahead and type this with me. Function. Okay, now that's a keyword in JavaScript. And then we have to give this function a name. I'll just call it say hello for lack of any other better ideas. Okay, and then notice that's camel case. And then after say hello, I need to put a pair of parentheses like that. Now VS Code knows that parentheses always come in pairs, so you really only have to type in one and it'll give you two. Okay, now move your cursor to the right of that closing parentheses, and then type in a pair of curly braces. So curly braces are these things. Okay, now you may not be familiar with that. I don't know if you've ever used curly braces before, but you can find that it's next to the P key, and you have to hold down the shift to get it. And again, all you have to do is type in one curly brace, and VS Code will put the other one in there because it knows they always come in pairs like that. Okay, so if you've never used curly braces before, here they are right here. Okay, so I've got function, say hello, pair of parentheses, pair of curly braces. put your cursor in between the curly braces like I have, and then hit enter. Okay, now what we're going to do, this is what we call declaring a function. We'll talk about that in just a minute here, but I want to show you how we can take these 3 lines of code and put them into a function. So go ahead and cut those. So I'm just going to select all 3 of those lines and choose Control X. And then I'm going to go ahead and put them in between those curly braces. That's why I left that empty line right there. So here's where I want to paste it. But now I want to be careful to indent these 3 console log lines. So your code should look just like that, exactly as I have it, with the same exact indentation and everything. Now, sometimes the indentation is set differently in VS Code. I can't remember if we talked about this already, but mine is set to 2 spaces here. Your indentation, your tabbing might be set to 4 spaces. Don't worry about it. You can just leave it as is if you want. Okay. Anyways, so what we've got here is a function called say hello. I'll get into the details of how this all works in a little bit right here. And every time we make use of this function, it's going to run these lines of code. So, as I mentioned, we want to create functions when we want to repeat the same task over and over again in our program, or execute the same group of statements over and over again. So now that I've declared this function, I can actually use it like so. And I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you. So here I can type in say hello, and then a pair of parentheses like that. And then I should put a semicolon there, but I don't have to. Okay, so what's going to happen is when this page loads, the browser is going to see this and it's going to know what the function means. And then when it gets down here, it's going to actually make use of the function, and it's going to execute all the statements that are inside the function. Those 3 console logs are the statements. Okay, now here's the beauty of a function. If I wanted to repeat those console logs, I don't have to repeat the code for them. All I have to do is call the function, or use the function again like this. So again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself right here. Okay, so here's how I want you to have your code set up right now. So go ahead and save your changes, and then go back over to the browser. If I can find it here. Oh, I need to open this page in the browser. Oops, sorry. There we go. Okay, let's go ahead and open this page in the browser. So right click here and choose Open in Default Browser. Okay, now mine's coming up on my other screen, but I'll drag it over here. There's nothing to look at on the page, but what we can do is check the console log right here. And there we can see that our function executed 2 times. And that's because of these 2 lines right here. Okay, now there's a lot to unpack right here, but the important thing that I want you to note is that if you ever want to repeat a group of statements, then you should turn it into a function. That way, we don't have to duplicate these statements over and over again. All we do is refer to that function. Okay, now we have a lot to unpack, so let's start talking about the details here. Okay, first of all, there are 2 steps to incorporating functions into your program. First of all, you have to declare the function. So right here, put your cursor right above that word function, and then put a comment. So remember, the lines that start with the 2 forward slashes are comments, and they'll show up in green in VS Code. You can make it say declare the function. Okay, now this defines the name of your function. We called it say hello, and then the code that's supposed to be a part of the function. So that's what we call declaring the function. Once you declare it, you can go ahead and use it as many times as you want. So here we're actually using it. Okay, actually 2 times we're using it, and that's why we saw these 3 lines execute in the console log 2 times, because we actually used the function 2 times. Okay, now I said using the function 2 times. That's not really the correct term. The correct term is invoking the function. So here we're invoking the function 2 times. Now, to make matters even worse, most programmers don't say invoking, they say something else. They say calling the function. So here we're actually calling the function 2 times. So And I'll use calling. That's the term that I usually use, but invoking or calling, they mean the same thing. Most programmers say call the function. Other programmers will say invoke the function. Either way, you got to know what both of them mean. Okay, so the two parts here are declare the function, and this is where you define it. You give it a name, and you put the code that's supposed to execute inside of those curly braces. And then down here we can put a comment that says call/invoke the function. Okay, those are the two parts to incorporating functions into your web page. All right, let's dig a little bit deeper into declaring functions. Okay, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to bring this over here. These are my notes for this that I'm reading off of right here. And I want to show you this. So I'm going to pump this up a little bit so you can see it. Now, this is not real code, but what I want to show you here is this is just kind of the template which shows you the syntax for creating functions. Whenever you want to declare a function, the first thing you have to do is type in the keyword function. So we've been talking about keywords like const and let. Function is another keyword. If you want to declare a function, you always have to start with that keyword function. And then what you do is you put a space, and after the space, you give the function a name. So here I just gave it something generic, but it says name goes here. And now that name should be camel case. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, but any good JavaScript programmer will use camel case when they name their functions. Okay. After the name goes a pair of parentheses, and sometimes stuff goes inside the parentheses. Okay. So right here, if you do put stuff inside the parentheses, we call those parameters, and I'll talk about those in just a little bit right here. Okay. But anyways, after the parentheses, you put a pair of curly braces and you split them apart, and then inside the curly braces are the statements that you want to get executed every time the function gets used or called or invoked. Okay, so that's the basic syntax for declaring a function. Okay, we'll get into these details in a little bit right here. All right. So before we move on, I want to show you another example here. And now I'm just looking at the page that this video is on right here as an example. So here we've got a bunch of code that converts temperatures from from Celsius to Fahrenheit. Okay, so for example, this line of code takes 10 degrees and then uses it in the equation to convert 10 degrees into Fahrenheit, and then the result will be stored in that variable. So here and you should be familiar with this from when we talked about variables and data types earlier in the course. Okay, so we're doing this a few times. First, we're converting 10 degrees from Celsius to Fahrenheit, and then 50, and then 75, and then 100. Okay, so we're repeating a task over and over again. So here, if you have code that looks like this, then you're going to want to turn this code into a function so that you don't have to repeat all this stuff. Because if I repeat this equation over and over again, I could have a typo in one of those lines. It's better just to have the equation write it once, and then inside of a function, as we'll do in just a minute. And that way you'll avoid bugs. And if you need to change the way the function works, you only have to do it in one place instead of updating all the expressions on all these lines right here. Okay, so let's take this code and make a function that will make this code a lot better. And this will give us some practice with writing functions. Okay, so go back to VS Code here, and then right where we left off, let's go ahead and declare a function. So remember to do that, you start with the keyword function, and then we have to put a space, and after the space we have to give our function a name, and we should use camel case. Now your function names should be good names, and what I mean by that are names that describe what the function does. So here we're gonna name this function convert to Fahrenheit. By the way, Fahrenheit is really hard to spell, but make sure you use camel case and make sure you spell it right, otherwise you might have bugs in your code. So yeah, that's a tricky one, but we got to be very aware of our spelling and our capitalization. Okay, so there is the name of our function, And then, as I said earlier, after the name of the function comes a pair of parentheses. So you only have to type in the first one, and VS Code will put the second one in place for you. And then move your cursor over to the right, so it's on just the right of that closing parentheses, and put in the curly braces. So all you have to do is put in the opening curly brace, and VS Code will put in the closing one because it knows they always come in pairs like that. Okay, and now go ahead and hit enter and split those curly braces apart. Okay, so again, here's the syntax for setting up a function so that you can declare a function that you can use later. Okay, and now I had mentioned that sometimes things can go inside of the parentheses, but they don't always have to be there. So if you put something here inside the parentheses, we call that a parameter. So we're going to add a parameter here, and we're going to use camel case. And let's type this in: temp Celsius, all one word using camel case. So this is going to be a temperature in Celsius, and then inside the curly braces here, we're going to put code that will convert a temperature in Celsius into Fahrenheit. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to declare a constant inside there, and be very careful to indent all of the statements that go in between the first line and the last line of the function declaration should be indented. So, and that's really important, otherwise your code is very difficult to read. So let's declare a variable with const and call it temp Fahrenheit. And again, be careful with your spelling, otherwise you're going to have problems if you misspell it in a few places. We're going to set that equal to temp Celsius, and then we're going to do the rest of our equation. So I'm going to put asterisk and then 9 divided by 5 plus 32, and that's a statement right there. So I'm going to put a semicolon on the end of that line. And then I'm going to put one more line here inside this function, and it's going to look like this: return. So there's another keyword in JavaScript, return, and I'll explain what it means in just a minute here. But what we want to return is the temp Fahrenheit. Okay. All right. A lot going on here. By the way, I can't remember if I mentioned this a minute ago, but the lines that we put inside of a function, the ones that are indented like that, that's what we call the body of the function. Okay. Now, one thing that I want you to note about this function compared to the first one that we wrote right up here is that this function has a parameter. In other words, it's got something inside the parentheses right there. Our first function, it was just the parentheses were just empty. Okay, so when you have something inside the parentheses here, that's what we call a parameter. And really all that is a placeholder that allows you to refer to something inside of the body of your function. I'll show you what I mean right here. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead just a little bit here. Before I finish explaining how this function works, we're going to go ahead and call it or invoke it right away right here. So put your cursor right there underneath the function declaration, and in order to use the function or call it, invoke it, whichever term you want to use, you type in the function name, so convert to Fahrenheit, and then a pair of parentheses. If the function has parameters, you're going to put something inside the parentheses. If the function doesn't have any parameters, you're going to leave these parentheses empty. Okay, so in this case, let's go ahead and put 10 inside of the parentheses there. And then I'm going to put a semicolon at the end of that line. Okay, now I do have to add one more thing here, and this is different than our say hello function too. I'm going to go over to the left-hand side right there, the beginning of that line, and I'm going to declare a variable and call it f1 and set that equal to, and then we're going to call our function. Okay, now, so here's our parameter of 10. That's what we want to convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit. And so when we call our function here, this temp Celsius is going to be 10 because that's what we put here inside the parentheses. By the way, this is called passing in a value. When you when you call a function and put something inside the parentheses, that's called passing in a value. Here we're passing in a value of 10. So what's going to happen is it's going to start to execute all the lines of code that's inside the body of the function, And here our temp Celsius parameter is going to be a placeholder for 10 because that's what we're feeding into our function. Okay, and then this line of code right here means that this function returns a value. So again, return is a special keyword in JavaScript. So if you want your function to return a value, you have to type in return and then whatever it is that you want it to return. So that's the converted temperature in Fahrenheit. Okay. Now, because this function returns something, that means that when I call it here, I can use it to initialize a variable. Okay. So this variable here, F1, is going to be storing the temperature in Fahrenheit. Okay. So if you look at this line of code right here, we are calling the convert to Fahrenheit function. We're passing in a temperature in Celsius, which is 10, a value of 10. And what it's going to do is return that temperature in Fahrenheit, and whatever it returns is going to get stored in that F1 variable right there. Okay, so remember all the lines of code that I showed you before where we were converting all those temperatures? We can use our function instead. Here, I'm going to go ahead and go const F2 equals convert to Fahrenheit, and I'll go ahead and pass in 50. And what it's going to return over here on this side is whatever 50 degrees in Fahrenheit is. Okay, so I think you're starting to see now there's different ways to set up functions. We've been talking about parameters and return values, and some functions have those and some functions don't. Okay, so, all right. The beautiful thing about using parameters is it makes your functions flexible. So this allows me to pass in any value and it will go ahead and convert it. So I can pass in 10 or 50 or any other number that I want. So that's what parameters are for. They're little, they allow you to pass values into your function, like temp Celsius right here, and then those are basically placeholders that you can use inside of the body of your function. So you can think of temp Celsius as a variable that lives inside of your function. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in one of the next lessons too. Boy, this is a lot of heavy-duty stuff, so we might have a lot to talk about in class when you come back. And by the way, you might want to be reading my notes in the web page that go along with this video, because I have a feeling that my written instructions might be better than my verbal ones. But anyways, we'll see how it goes. Now at this point in our program here, we're not going to see those temperatures in Fahrenheit. We're not going to see F1 and F2 unless we output them either with an alert or a console log. I tend to lean towards console logs because then you don't have to press the OK button like you do with an alert, and that can be kind of annoying. So let's go ahead and console log F1, and then we can go ahead and console log F2 like that. Okay, go ahead and save your changes, and then let's go back over to the browser and refresh the page. Here it is over here. I'm going to go ahead and just clear out my log by pressing that button before I refresh. There we go. There's our say hello function running, and here is our temperatures converted from Celsius to Fahrenheit. Okay. Why don't we make this a little bit useful and allow our user to enter any temperature in Celsius that they want. So let's make a little program that could be kind of semi-useful right here. So I'm going to go back over to VS Code, and I'm going to put my cursor down here after a few empty lines, and let's declare a variable called Celsius today. And so I'm going to use const to do that, and I'm going to call it Celsius today camel case, and then I'm going to initialize it by using the prompt command. Now, by the way, I've been calling prompt and alert, I've been calling those commands, but they're actually functions. So here we go. I'm calling the prompt function. I didn't want to tell you that these were functions before because we hadn't talked about functions yet, but JavaScript has a bunch of built-in functions that you don't have to declare. You can just call them. So they're declared for you, and you can just call them or invoke them or use them whenever you want. And that's really nice because they do a lot of things for you so that you don't have to write those functions yourself. But I think you know how the prompt function works. We have to pass in a parameter, which is supposed to be a string. So here inside the parentheses here, I'm going to make it say, what's the temp in Celsius today? Okay, question mark. Okay, there we go. So here we're calling the prompt function and we're passing in a string value as the parameter. And you know what the prompt function does. It's going to make a window pop up, and it's whatever parameter we pass in is going to show up inside that window. Okay, and then it's going to allow the user to enter something, and whatever the user enters is what the prompt function returns. So whatever they enter is going to get stored inside of this variable right here. Okay, and now on the next line here, I'm going to declare another variable, and I'm going to go const Fahrenheit. Be careful how you spell that because that's a tricky one. Today equals, and I'm going to go ahead and call our convert to Fahrenheit function that we defined a moment ago. So to do that, I type in the name of the function and then a pair of parentheses. I always put my semicolon in at the end of that line and then fill in the parentheses. But the value that we want to pass in as the parameter to convert to Fahrenheit is going to be whatever the user typed in. And that's going to be stored in our Celsius today variable. Okay. All right. And then finally, what we'll do on the next line here is we'll alert the Fahrenheit today variable. Okay. And we'll see how this works here. Now, again, alert is also a function, and I was calling it a command, but it's a function that you're supposed to pass in one parameter, and I think you know what that parameter does. It shows you whatever you pass in as the parameter is going to show up inside the alert box. Let's see that right now. So go ahead and save your changes here. Go back to the browser and reload the page. And you can see there's our prompt function running. Whatever I type into it is going to be returned by the prompt function, and we're going to store it in our temp cell or our Celsius today variable. So I'm going to hit OK right here. I typed in 0, and then we pass that 0 into our convert to Fahrenheit function, and it's going to return a value of 32, and then we alert that value. Okay, so there you go. Here's a semi-useful, although not really all that useful, but the cool thing about this is the user of your web page can convert any temperature they want from Celsius into Fahrenheit. Okay, so there are various ways that you can declare your functions, and we've already seen a few of them here. So we started out with a function that has no parameters and doesn't return anything. So and sometimes you have a function where you don't really want to get anything from it. In other words, you don't want it to return anything. You just want it to execute some lines of code. Okay, so whenever we call the say hello function, it's going to execute those 3 lines of code that are in the body inside those curly braces. Okay, and then what we did is we created a different type of function right here, or a different variation of a function, I should say, and it allows you to pass in a value, and then it does some calculation with the value. It runs it through that expression right there on that line, and then it returns it. Okay, so if the function returns something, that means that when you call it, like we are down here, when you call it, you can use it to initialize a variable. In this case, F1. So we're going to initialize F1 to be whatever the return value is of this function. In other words, whatever it returns right there. Okay, so there's different ways to slice and dice functions. You have functions with no parameters. You can have a function with a parameter. You can have a function that returns something. You can have a function that doesn't return anything, like our first one. But what I want to show you now is you can have functions that have more than one parameter. So let's scroll on down. We're getting good practice here writing functions. Go ahead and hit enter a few times. And actually, you know what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and comment out these 3 lines of code because I don't want to have to deal with the prompt and the alert. Those are going to get in the way every time we refresh the page. So I'm going to select those 3 lines and I'm going to press Control/, and that will put the comments in front of each of those lines so that it won't execute, and then we won't have to see the prompt and the alert because that slows us down a little bit. Okay, let's declare a function, and this one's going to have more than 1 parameter. Now, I don't have a really good idea right now, so this is just a useless generic function, but it does demonstrate a function that has more than 1 parameter. Okay, so let's get started. To declare a function, we type in the keyword function, and then we give it a name, and it should be camel case. And by the way, there are some other rules to naming your functions, just like there are with naming your variables, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So anyways, we're going to name this function useless function, camel case, please. Be careful with your spelling and your capitalization because JavaScript is sensitive to all that stuff. Okay, and so there's the name of our function. After the name, we put a pair of parentheses, and then I like to skip ahead a little bit, and after the parentheses, I put the curly braces in place like that, and then I go ahead and split the curly braces apart, and that's what I call setting the table. So I just like to get all the syntax in place, and then I go fill in the details. So there's what you should have in your code right now, and as I said, this function is going to have more than 1 parameter. Now this is a useless function, so I don't have a meaningful name to give to my parameter. I'm just going to call it param1 like that. And then if you want to add multiple parameters to your function declaration, the syntax rule says that you need to use a comma. So I'm going to put a comma there. And then I like to put a space. You don't have to put a space, but I like to just to give some breathing room to my code. It makes it a little bit easier to read. After that comma, you can create your second parameter. So I'm just going to call it param2. Okay, so here we have a function that has 2 parameters. So we'll see how we can call or invoke this function in just a minute, but let's finish declaring it first. So here I'm going to move my cursor in between the curly braces and make sure that all these lines of code are indented nice and neat inside, the function. So here's where the function starts, here's where it begins, or here's where it starts, here's where it ends down here. Everything that's inside of those curly braces needs to be indented to make your code easy to read. Okay, so inside the body here, I'm just going to put 2 statements, and it's going to look like this. Console log, and then I'll just say, let's just do this. We'll pass in a string. Console log is basically a function too, but technically it's a different type of function. It's got the dot in it, so that makes it something a little bit different. But anyways, you can think of console log as a function for now. Okay, anyways, we're going to pass in a string that says the value of param1 is, okay, and then I'm going to actually do some string concatenation right here. So I want to put my cursor after that quotation mark, and then here we're going to concatenate param1 like that, and then I'm going to move my cursor to the end of the line and put a semicolon there. And now the second statement that I put inside the body of this function is going to look a lot like the first one. So I'm going to do the shortcut to duplicate this line. Make sure your cursor is on that line and go ahead and do Alt-Shift down arrow. Okay, but let's change this a little bit. Let's change this to the value of param2 is, and then we'll concatenate whatever param2 is right there. So this is a useless function, except for the fact that it demonstrates a function that has multiple parameters. Okay, so now we've declared this function. We're ready to go ahead and start using it. And by that, I mean calling it or invoking it. So put your cursor right there underneath the function declaration. And remember to call a function. You type in the function name. And then regardless of whether it has parameters or not, you always put the parentheses there. So put the parentheses there, and then I like to put my semicolon in before I forget, even though it's not a big deal in JavaScript. And then what we can do is we can pass in two values for our parameters. So here, let's go ahead and pass in salt for the first parameter. So there's the first value that I'm passing in. It happens to be a string, so I'm using quotation marks for it. And then I put a comma after that closing quotation mark. And then you can put a space, but you don't have to. I like to. And then the second value is also going to be a string. And I'm going to make it be the string value pepper, like that. Okay, so not a big deal. This is not an impressive function, but what it's going to do is once the program gets down to this line of code, it's going to take these two values and it's going to execute all the statements that are inside the function. So if you save this here and then go back over to the browser, and I'm going to clear the log and refresh the page, you should see the value of param1 is salt and the value of param2 is pepper. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead, and the great thing about functions is you declare them once and you use them as many times as you want. Okay, so I'm going to go down here to where we are calling or invoking our function, and I'm going to do Alt-Shift down arrow to duplicate that line. And I'm just going to pass in a few different parameters here. Let's go ahead and change the first parameter. Let's make that a string value that says sugar. And then let's change the second parameter to be a string with a value of spice. Okay, there you go. Okay, so now, again, we declare our function once, but we can invoke it or call it many times, and it's just going to execute all the lines of code that are inside the body of the function. All right, so I think you know what's going to happen here. You can go ahead and run this code, and I think you know what you'll see in the console log. Okay, this video is getting long, much longer than I want my videos to be, but this is very important stuff right here. So functions are just critical. I'm sure they're a little bit fuzzy in your brain right now, but we are going to practice using them pretty much every single class from here on out. Okay, just to wrap things up, I want to show you something, and we'll see how this sits with you as beginners who are just learning about functions. I'm going to go ahead and paste in some code right here. I'm actually just getting this off the web page that goes with this video, and I'm going to paste it right there like that, and then I'm going to fix the indentation so that everything's lined up nice and neat here. Okay, now as I mentioned earlier, prompt is a function that's built into JavaScript. We didn't declare it, it's just there for us to invoke or call whenever we want. Okay, same with alert right here. Okay, now I bet you can guess whether or not the prompt and the alert function take parameters just by looking at this. And hopefully you can tell that because you see stuff inside the parentheses right here when we call the function, that indicates to us that this was declared with a parameter in mind. Okay, same with alert. Alert is a function that takes a parameter, and in this case this one's a little bit complicated, but what we're passing in is really one string that's a concatenation of three different strings. So what we're passing in is a string that concatenates hello plus whatever the name variable is storing plus an exclamation mark. So we're passing in one big string as a parameter to alert. Now here's the challenge that I have for you, because I've noticed that beginners tend to struggle with the difference between functions that return something and functions that don't. Okay, one of these two functions, prompt or alert, one of those two returns something. Can you figure out which one returns something just by looking at these two lines of code and by the way these functions are being called? And now, if you don't know that now, that's okay, but we need to get to the point where you'll be able to answer this question because it's a critical one. So let's go ahead, and this will be something that we can talk about when we meet next time. So make sure to ask me about this right here. But this would be a great test question. Hint, hint, hint. So one of these functions returns a value and the other one doesn't. And you should be able to recognize that just by looking at those two lines of code right there. All right, that will do it. I think this is the longest video of the course, but again, important stuff. Thanks for hanging in there.